Welcome to PTSD 911 Presents. My name is Conrad Weaver. I'm your host, and I'm so glad you decided to join us today for this program. I have an amazing guest today. Originally from Australia, Dr. Phil Doc, as he's called. Baquie is a licensed mental health professional with a unique set of skills. Doc is a highly experienced communicator who specializes in training law enforcement and military personnel. And part of his passion to work with sheepdogs comes from his own background in the military, law enforcement, and private security contracting professionals. In addition to holding a master's degree in counseling and a doctor of psychology, he is a law enforcement firearms instructor, certified in high-risk global protective operations, and a trained hostage crisis negotiator. Doc, welcome to PTSD 911 Presents.
Glad to be with you, Conrad.
So tell me a little bit about how you got started working with first responders in the mental health field.
So have a background, as you just shared, within part of my previous experiences working in law enforcement and the military as well. I was infantry and then with a tactical PSYOP unit for a while too. And that afforded me the privilege of being able to get my US citizenship. And it was a real privilege to be able to serve and to give back to a country that's given me so much since moving here as an immigrant in 1999. And as I pushed into the mental health field, it was just a natural gravitation towards working with law enforcement and military, simply because, I understood that mindset and the hurt that's involved and the trauma that's experienced within these professions. And so I think there's nothing more fulfilling in life than being able to serve others and give back. And so this is a way in which I've had the privilege of being able to serve and give back to my fellow brothers and sisters in arms, and then also on the street with law enforcement.
So what have you seen over the past the years that you've been involved with this? How has there been any kind of changes? What's been the trajectory of mental health and wellness in our first responders?
Unfortunately, despite so much attention to the issues that are going on in law enforcement and in the military, and all first responders, right? Of course, not just law enforcement. But the last few years, we've all seen it. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science or a degree in this stuff to figure out, there's a serious issue going on. The public perception, the safety for officers and first responders, it's becoming a more dangerous world out there for them. And so there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of pressure. And now, especially with social media and the ability for everyone to turn a camera on at usually an edited point in time in a lot of the cases, within situations and circumstances that get videoed. And so officers are getting sued, and for what an officer gets paid in order to risk their life, that's tough stuff. And so it really is a self-sacrificing profession to be a first responder in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. So, in the last few years, there's definitely been a shift, a pivot in the direction that is unhealthy, simply because of the pressures and the stresses that all of our first responders are facing these days.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked with both first responders as well as military. Mm-hmm. What are the similarities? What are the differences in the trauma that these folks face?
Well, interestingly, I find a great deal of similarity in the way in which first responders and military personnel function in regards to their temperament and personalities and mindset. And so they're very similar. They draw a very similar type, very similar archetype. And, the warrior, the sheepdog, as Colonel
Dave Grossman.
Grossman, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about, I think he coined that term, I believe. That mindset, the protector mindset and the mentality and serving. And so there's a lot of great similarities between the military and law enforcement. And in regards to trauma as well, of course, military, we know what they're experiencing simply with the ongoing wars that have taken place over the last 20 years within the US. But then also within law enforcement, I find in a way their trauma is even further acute from the perspective of with the military, we've got set times of deployment.
Mm-hmm.
And, you might be on a deployment, and special operations tend to have a lot shorter deployments than do conventional military units. But regardless, there's a time period where you're out of country or out of the green zone, where your life is at risk. And then you're back home and training and preparing again to deploy. Whereas law enforcement, it's 24/7. It's the job. You never know what is going to happen. You never know what that next call is going to be. And so there's a propensity within law enforcement to have a higher level of stress just from the perspective of they're always on guard. They always have to be ready. They never know what's coming next. A traffic stop could be the most dangerous or fatal thing that they experience. And so things that seem like menial tasks are not necessarily that way. It could be life-altering or traumatic incidents as a result of just performing their job, which they do as a 9 to 5, or if they're shift work, 7 to 7. So it's a rough deal for law enforcement from that perspective, because their levels and exposure to trauma are in a way so much higher than even the military.
In your practice, what have you, what's been the more typical treatment that you've, or should I say symptoms that you've treated? What are some of those things that really kind of rise to the surface?
So within post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and this is what you're focusing on with this documentary, which is fantastic, by the way. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
what you're doing and bringing attention to this. This is huge.
Of course.
But some of the big issues, the hypervigilance is probably one of the biggest in regards to an inability to be able to settle oneself down. So within the brain, the amygdala within the brain is the area of the brain that is hyperactive in a way when it comes to PTSD, because that is the center where the fight, flight, or flee comes from. And that is overstimulated due to the constant exposure often within law enforcement and within first responders. And so that creates a hypervigilance because it's constantly pushing out to the body, both physiologically and also cognitively. It's pushing out to the body, hey, there's an issue, there's a problem, be alert, look out. And so it's difficult to be able to function correctly, even to do your job, because if there's that hyper level of arousal within the amygdala, it creates tension and stress on top of the stress that's already there within the profession. And so seeing a lot of that, probably one of the biggest byproducts or consequences of stress and within PTSD is a lack of being able to sleep. And so insomnia is a massive issue. And that overstimulation also pushes into the inability for someone who's suffering from PTSD or post-traumatic stress to be able to push into the deeper REM cycles of sleep, where the body needs and the mind needs in order to be able to defrag and get things back into a healthy manner. And so there's some of the biggest issues I see folks coming in with, or in relationship, often high levels of stress show themselves in the functionality of marriages and interpersonal relationships, as well as work-related issues in regards to relationships. Sometimes, the chief or the sheriff or the head of a department will say, hey, you need to go get help. You've got some anger issues, or you've got some communication issues. And a lot of the time it stems from what they're experiencing on the job. It stems from the post-traumatic stress that officers and first responders are facing.
Does the lack of sleep then create kind of a cycle of just kind of ratcheting up the trauma, the results of the trauma?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's self-perpetuating, and it gets worse and worse. And what I find is then another major issue that comes into play. Once again, this isn't rocket science. What we're talking about here, it's pretty evident and pretty obvious, especially for those who are in first responding professions and the members of their families know the results of what I'm talking about here with the stress. One of the biggest things that we do see, unfortunately, is turning to vices that can help put one to sleep. And the most common is alcohol. When you look at other forms of drugs, illegal substances and whatnot that might be able to help, or legal prescription medications that might be able to help, often an abuse of those drugs will come up if there's a drug test done. And of course, within law enforcement, that's what you're primarily fighting a lot of the time. So, partaking in any substances that might be illegal is not good for your professional ability to continue working.
Sure.
But then also alcohol is readily available and socially acceptable. And often in first responder professions, it becomes part of the culture of coping. Of, oh man, you had a rough day. Come on, when the shift ends, let's go grab some beers. Or hey, I got a bottle of whiskey in my drawer. Let's take care of that, once we get done for the day. And that camaraderie that takes place, which is good in regards to being able to de-stress and defragmentize what's taken place for the day within the brotherhood or the sisterhood of fellow professionals. When the alcohol's involved, it can often elevate to the point where once the officer gets home, they're drinking on their own, they're trying to get to sleep, can't get to sleep, so they'll start drinking some more. And then that creates another whole issue just from originally often trying to get to sleep. And so the alcohol actually also is an inhibitor, as are various different psychotropic medications which get prescribed to first responders who are suffering from PTSD often, end up inhibiting the ability for the mind and the brain to be able to push into the REM cycles of sleep, which is required once again to be able to defrag and bring someone's back into a homeostatic state within their mind and within their body.
I know in your work, you really like to focus on what you call left of bang. Can you describe what that is? What bang is and left and right? What does that? What do those terms mean?
Sure. It's a borrowed from a military term. So bang would be a critical incident, a critical event. That might be exchanging of fire or contact with the enemy. Could be literally a bang with, a roadside bomb or whatnot, IED. So whatever that event might be, a critical incident that might become a traumatic event, which we can talk about in a moment. But a critical incident is what we'd call a bang. And so often what's happening now in law enforcement and military and first responders is we're focusing on, which is fantastic. This is good. It's not a criticism, but focusing on the right of bang. So post an event happening, post a critical incident, post a traumatic event, we're bringing in, peer-to-peer support, which is needed. Bringing in critical incident response teams, once again, needed. Bringing in debriefing teams. Once again, this is important and needed to help officers and to help those in the first responding professions process what they've gone through with a critical incident or traumatic event. This is great, but the problem is that there's not enough training on the front side of critical incidences and traumatic events. And so what I do is we call it left of bang. So often officer resiliency training is right of bang. Like after an event, they'll go through and help process to try to minimize the effects of post-traumatic stress, which may or may not turn into PTSD. And so these are great programs that are doing incredible things nationwide, and they are helping. But what if we can preemptively strike ahead of traumatic events? What if we can get on the front end and give officers tools with which they can combat within themselves the traumatic stress that they're facing before the events are taking place? And so I'm talking about getting in with agencies on the front end when new officers, when new special agents are coming in their academies, training more specifically and more intentionally with helping deal with the traumatic stress that is inevitable in the professions. Because it's, there's one statistic in some of my research I came across was an average law enforcement professional within their career will experience 188 traumatic events or critical
Wow.
incidences within their profession. And that's pretty rough.
That's crazy.
It is
Yeah.
crazy. And that was just amongst law enforcement. You think about firefighters and paramedics. Every call for a firefighter or paramedic is dealing with major trauma. It's not necessarily just a cat up the tree. Or within law enforcement, sometimes it might be responding to a broken down vehicle on the side of the road. But often with firefighters, they experience even higher level of trauma and critical incidences than law enforcement do. And so, being able to get on the front end to help prepare, we train physically, we train our agents, we train our officers, we train our soldiers, we train them to be physical and to be able to handle the physical stresses of their job. We train them to be able to handle their legal aspects of their job. We train them to be tactically sound in their operations on how they function to keep themselves and their partners and the communities safe. But there is nowhere near enough training on the most important factor, which is the number one killer within first responders, which is stress-related incidences in regards to, you look at the FBI put out a stat on, and I remember you and I had talked about this previously, when we first spoke, on the FBI's statistic on the age of death for law enforcement officers is around 62. The US Marshals, the statistic they came out with is at 57.
Wow.
On the national average age of death for law enforcement officers, which is some 20 years less than a civilian, which is around 77 on the national average.
Right.
And so just signing up for one of these first responder jobs is automatically, statistically taking 20 years off your life. And the causes of death primarily, overwhelmingly, are preventable causes. And this is the unnecessary aspects of what's taking place within the first responder community that really does create a 911 issue, right?
Right.
These unnecessary causes of death, primarily due to heart disease, heart attack, all of these things that can be prevented. And where is the heart attack and the heart disease coming from? Well, primarily it's coming from stress. It's coming from untreated traumatic stress that is creating injuries, that's creating disorders within our first responder community, that's costing lives. It's taking 20 years off the average first responder's life. That's unacceptable.
That's crazy. I just did a quick calculation. If you work for 30 years and you average 188 critical incidents like this, you're averaging about one every 2 months.
Okay. So now that's if you're working for 30 years.
Right.
So let's say, I can't remember off the top of my head the average time in profession for law enforcement, let's say, but for those that work 10 years or 15 years, because the burnout rate is so high.
Yeah.
With first responders, most don't make it 30 years.
Right.
So you think about that from a statistical average at 188. If that's 10 years, how much greater? That's triple.
That's 18 a year.
That's crazy.
And not only that, but then you're adding, those are the critical incidents. Those are those incidents that are really up there. Now you're adding the day-to-day incidents and the stress of the job. Maybe it's even the stress of management that isn't behaving the way they need to behave, And then you have the environmental stress of what's going on in the world and the other things like that add on top of that. So not only have these specific incidents that are critical, that are high level stress, but then you have those day-to-day things that add on to that. And so it's no wonder their lives are cut short by 20 years.
Well, and that one of the first questions you asked in regards, what am I seeing in regards to trends within law enforcement and first responder communities? You think about just even with everything that we face now, when you look at it even from a civilian perspective on the trauma and the stress that's involved with coronavirus. And the last couple of years of having to deal with that, it's created worldwide stress. Yep. And let alone having to have a profession which, with law enforcement is statistically the highest rate of one of the highest rates of suicide within a profession. So you add all of the stresses on top of that, and it's no wonder why the tragedy that we see and we experience within first responders absolutely unnecessarily and tragically taking their lives with law enforcement and military.
You talked about this training needs to be in the academy. As we know, we haven't seen a whole lot of that, of in-depth training for first responders across the board. There are, small segments where they are doing more of that. What needs to happen at the academy level so that these new recruits can be resilient enough, left of bang to get through, and to survive in a healthy way?
Well, it starts at the top. It starts at the top and it trickles down from the top. It starts with our leadership. It starts with our chiefs. It starts with our boards. It starts with fostering a mentality of mental wellness within our leadership, within law enforcement, within fire departments, within paramedics, within all first responding professions. From there, the trickle-down effect takes place. If it's understood that it is not just acceptable but expected for officers, for agents to take care of themselves and their mental health, then that's where the change can take place. Within academies and trainees, conversations to be consistently had. And the thing is, it's not just like doing blocks of, well, for the next 3 days, we're going to talk about mental health. It's implementing that in all aspects of the training, of recognizing, hey, you know what? We find that, within our profession, when we go to calls like this tends to create a lot of stress for the officer. And being able to implement within all the different aspects of training, even from a tactical perspective, like the ability to be able to implement some of the pre-resiliency training that I do in helping from a tactician's perspective of being able to have more control over the way in which one functions and operates under stress. And so some of these aspects are taught, but on a greater level to recognize and realize that being able to take care of ourselves and our mind, not just our body and our training in regards to tactics and the law, let's say, but being able to have that aspect of knowing and understanding that all of these different areas of study are permeated and really underlying these areas of instruction with the mental health aspects of things. And then also we need to be careful about how we word things, because the words mental health have a stigma to them.
Sure.
And like I was saying earlier, starting with the leadership is where the stigma has to get reversed. And it is happening, man. Some of the departments that I've worked with and some of the agencies I've worked with are doing an incredible job of normalizing this from the top down, and that's where it needs to take place. But unfortunately, there's still so much of the old school mentality out there in regards to suck it up, buttercup, push on, rub a little dirt on it and move on and you'll be fine. No, you won't be fine. And this is where this deadly mentality's got to stop.
What can someone do? Perhaps they're, fairly new, been on the police force for a couple of years, been on, running to fires for a couple of years. They're not in leadership, and they see this is an important thing, but their department, their agency is not on board with it. What can they do to lead up?
Well, man, one is put your oxygen mask on first, right? And I remember I think it was a Southwest flight I was on one time, and they've always got comedians.
Oh yeah,
the flight attendants. I remember the flight attendant saying something like, after you put your face mask on yourself, if you're traveling with children, put it on your child with the most potential. I always thought that was fun. Anyways, but yeah, it's that self-care aspect of recognizing, if my leadership is not on board with this, what can I do to, one, take care of myself, and then also how can I serve others within my profession? What can I do to be an influencer within my department? Still being respectful of my leadership.
Sure.
But what can I do, one, to take care of myself, and two, how can I keep an eye out for my brothers and my sisters, who are serving alongside of me?
That is such an important point to do the self-care. Because if I see something that's not happening in my agency, and I say we, I mean, I'm not a first responder, but if even in the work that I do, working with this film, doing these interviews, and I've worked hard at working to take care of me first.
Mm.
So I do have a daily ritual, daily routine that I do to just help keep my brain healthy. And I find that for me, it's so important going into, and perhaps like last week, I had a pretty serious interview with a retired firefighter who's been through some really dark things, and and even with his agency having challenges, and so I had to mentally prepare myself for that,
Mm.
and so that I stay healthy. And I think so much more for a first responder to really focus on taking care of oneself. So what's something practical that a individual can do if they want to start down this road of taking care of oneself?
Oh, that's a great question. There's so many things. First one is looking at what are my routines? What am I doing that's actually helping me or not or hurting me in just my choices that I'm making in my life? Am I making? What do I tend to do under stress? What are the things that I tend to go to without even thinking about from a self-awareness perspective? And so the first thing I would say is elevating the level of self-awareness. And this is one of the things we do in the resiliency training is because within the first responder professions and the military, I find that that's one of the biggest issues is a lower degree of self-awareness. And so being able to start paying attention to my thought processes, starting to pay attention to what my body's telling me, and recognizing what stress feels like, and recognizing the indicators and the warnings that I'm actually telling myself that I don't even realize. And that's the first step, I think, is to create that higher level of self-awareness. Now, that's not self-absorption. And as you pointed out before, taking care of ourselves is not being selfish or self-centered. It's actually enabling us to do our job better.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm in a position where I'm at a 5 on the, subjective units of stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm on a 5 versus running at an 8 or a 9 or a 10, I'm in a much better position to be able to serve others if I'm in a healthy place. And so having that higher degree of self-awareness, and there's a lot of great material out there that you can read. There's a lot of great opportunities, even if I would encourage everyone. Of course, I'm a mental health professional right now. I went back to school and got trained in all of this stuff. And so, of course, I'm very pro, hey, get help.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to maybe see a professional therapist, a counselor, someone that can help you process and enrich your understanding of what it means to take care of myself and to create a high level of self-awareness. Second thing would be looking at other obvious areas that I can gain control over quickly. What's my workout routine like? How am I taking care of myself physically? Because there's so many studies that show, that stress is reduced through physical exercise. My eating routines, my sleeping habits. What do these look like? My drinking habits. If I drink alcohol, if I'm smoking cigarettes, what's this doing for my health? So the practical areas that are the easy, low-hanging fruit parts of looking at this in a greater picture of what can I do to help myself create a high level of self-awareness. Look at the low-hanging fruit that I can easily change within my habits. Sleep, nutrition, exercise, and constantly asking myself this one question. And I use this all of the time. How's this helping me? How's this helping me? Even I can apply that to my thought processes. I can apply that to my relationships. I can apply that to my behaviors. How's this helping me? How's this helping others? What am I doing to contribute to me being the best version of myself? If I love my profession and what I'm doing, how can I prepare myself to be the best agent, to be the best paramedic, to be the best fireman, to be the best police officer, to be the best, soldier, whatever that might be? What can I do to make myself a force multiplier within my profession? And, that doesn't require leadership above me to tell me what to do. that requires the motivation within myself to recognize that I can be the force multiplier, and I can be the influencer on the battlefield or out on the street or, in the station.
Mm-hmm.
That's my responsibility.
So I listened to a podcast, and you're probably familiar also with the Craig Rochelle Leadership Podcast. He says in his new book, he says, our life moves in the direction of our strongest thoughts.
Mm.
And thinking of all this, how does that statement relate to taking care of oneself?
Wow, that's powerful and very deep. It's interesting, and I want to add to that. There's an old saying, it's been attributed to Aristotle, I believe. I know the Jesuits loved using it as well. And the saying is, give me a boy to the age of 6 and I'll give you the man that he'll become. Mm. And the reason I bring that up in relation to the quote you just gave, which is an excellent one, is to consider the way in which my background and my upbringing deeply influence who I am now and the decisions and the choices that I make for myself moving forward. And this is going back to that whole concept of self-awareness I talked about earlier, that my ability to process a situation and a circumstance really is filtered through my personality, my temperament, and also my previous experiences. And so these are the two bags in a way that we carry through life. My temperament, my personality that's unique to me, and my previous experiences that are unique to me. And so that is going to determine. Now, this will happen on an unconscious level without me even being aware of how my previous experiences and my temperament influences my choices. But if I can gain an understanding into what my tendencies are, how I tend to operate under stress, what my personality tends to do or interact or react, what my past experiences have been, either in childhood or later in life, previous traumatic events, previous core wounds that have taken place that influence and impact how I tend to get triggered within my interactions in my daily life. If I can create a higher degree of awareness of these things within myself, it gives me so much more of an opportunity to have control over what happens to me when I experience a critical incident. And so this is why a critical incident is not necessarily a traumatic event. And that's why you've seen it. And I'm sure those that you've interviewed and you've seen within what you're doing, we all have. We will see people go through identical events, crisis, through identical issues, yet sometimes have very dramatic results in regards to how they process the incidents. And so a critical incident need not be a traumatic event for an individual. It becomes a traumatic event when I process that critical incident based upon, once again, my temperament, personality, and my previous experiences in life. That is going to determine how I process a critical incident. And so if I have insecurities within myself, if I have areas within who I am that I've not processed through previously and come to an understanding of or come to terms with or know why I do what I do, then when a critical incident happens, I'm much more likely to push into traumatic stress and triggers from previous experiences that are compounded throughout my life, so that when that critical incident takes place, I feel a high degree and a high level of stress that becomes traumatic. That in turn will create a traumatic event from that critical incident. And without treatment and without correct leadership and guidance and correct thought processes and actions, that will over time turn into post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's why post-traumatic stress disorder is 100% unnecessary. It's also 100% treatable. And I know you had on here a couple of weeks back a colleague of mine who I love to death, Mr. Dan Jervis, right?
Yep.
With 22-0.
Right.
And, if anyone's watching this podcast and you haven't seen that interview, you need to go back and watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Because what Dan's doing is phenomenal. And in fact, we're working together and incorporating a program specifically to work together with what I'm doing on the front end of traumatic events or the front end of critical incidences, and then what Dan is doing on the back end with this incredible treatment where they're literally experiencing 100% healing of PTSD. I mean, if I hadn't
That's
seen it with
amazing.
my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it. But so it's incredible. But yeah, that whole idea of recognizing that my past experiences and my temperament and my personality dramatically influence how I process an incident, how I process the trauma that is seen around me within my professions.
Mm-hmm. This self-awareness and self-evaluation really takes some honesty. You have to take an honest look at yourself, and sometimes that's a painful experience, right? I mean, how do you get through that? How do you, when you look at, when I really look at my past, how do I get through that stuff that is kind of, hanging back there that's still affecting me today?
Well, Conrad, it takes courage. And,
Mm,
courage is not an absence of fear. It's the recognition of controlling my fear within the fight. And the fight for one's life for first responders is the by far the biggest challenge first responders face in any critical incidences they experience. Being shot at is not fun.
mm,
But I can tell you that the way in which I process my internal stresses is far more of a killer and far more dangerous than being shot at statistically when you look at the
mm,
numbers. I
mhm,
mean, heck, just look at the numbers from the stats perspective of the military, those that have been killed in action versus
mhm,
those that have committed suicide once home from combat.
mm.
And we see there now, in fairness, there's other influencing factors there too, right? It's not just
Sure.
what's happened in combat, but in reality, there's a huge influence there from their experiences. That's far more of a killer. Look in law enforcement. Suicide, the statistic on suicide versus line of duty deaths
Mm,
is 3 times within law enforcement, the amount of
mhm,
suicides versus line of duty deaths. So this stuff matters. It's a major issue, and it's far more of an area that needs to be addressed than has been. And once again, that's why what you're doing is so important. That's why what 22-0 is doing is so important, and the work that I'm doing and other organizations like us out there. We've got to get this changed, and it needs to happen immediately.
mhm. I know you're working with some law enforcement organizations there in your state. Tell us a little bit about your work that you're doing and the results that you're seeing.
Awesome. Yeah. So the Tactical Resilience Program is relatively fresh. So we've had the privilege of being able to work with some outstanding agencies. We worked with United States Marshal Service, did some training with them recently. I've started working with Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as well. Their leadership there is doing an outstanding job of treating the issues that are faced with post-traumatic stress and their agents. They're getting in on the front end, starting to do some training with their special agents in their academy, and also a few of the agencies surrounding the areas where I'm based in Tennessee and Mississippi. We're seeing some dramatic results. Just about to get started on some work with some special operations teams as well, which I'm really excited about. They have the highest level of suicide within the military at the moment.
Wow.
And honestly, it's just from the high tempo of which they're having to be called upon, and the level of critical incidences they're seeing is absurd. And of course, that's taking its result, or creating a result in a way in which it's causing a lot of operators and our special forces guys to really suffer
Mm,
because of honestly a lack of treatment and a lack of resources available to them. And so talking with some of the leadership there, just looking, hey, what do we need to do here to change these numbers? Because how many is too many? Well, one
Mm-hmm.
is too many
Mm-hmm.
lives that are lost. And what can we do to change this? And so it's really neat, the program that we're pushing out here with Tactical Resilience, of being able to help officers and help first responders and help military guys see that, hey, this isn't some, go hug a tree, cry on each other's shoulders, hippie stuff, that it's real, it's science-based, it's factual, it's going to help them become a greater tactician, a greater force multiplier within their profession. And that's important stuff. This isn't sissy work. It's not something to be afraid of.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of turn the camera on you and say, okay, how have you dealt with the stresses and the traumas that you've experienced in your military career and your law enforcement and all that?
Honestly, some of the things that we implement, things that I've gone through within my own personal life and my own experiences. I've been suicidal before. I've held a gun, wanting to take my life. I know what that feels like. And, one of the things that I learned through that experience, that we teach is, whenever you get to a position like that, you need to reach out. You need to reach out. You need to follow up with people, even people you may not necessarily call best friends, but just reach out to say, hey, can you just contact me? Can you keep an eye on me? Because right now I'm not doing well. Of having to lock up your firearms if that needs be. In fact, I had to give my keys to my safe room, which is got quite an arsenal in there. From previously, I've had to give that key to another person to say, hey, can you take care of this? Because right now I'm feeling strong, but all it's going to take is just one moment of me not feeling too good, and I don't know what I'm going to do, and I don't feel safe at the moment. That takes courage, once again, to be able to do that, to be able to reach out. And so from a personal perspective, of recognizing and seeing that, for the trauma that I've gone through and experienced in my life, creating the higher levels of self-awareness that we talked about before are so important. Now, I will say too, the resources that are available now that were not available for me at the time, especially with what Dan Jervis with 220 are doing, the trauma resiliency protocol that they've developed is literally life-changing, and it's enabling someone who's experienced traumatic stress to be able to process through their trauma and literally remove the emotional trauma from their brain and reposition it in a way so that the amygdala isn't constantly triggered, and their prefrontal cortex, which is the logic and the reason portion of the brain, is able to actually take over and create some stability within their mind, and that enables, once again, that will trickle down to a physiological perspective. But being able to see and recognize that there's treatments and options available now that even a few years ago we didn't have. And that, from a personal perspective, means a lot to me. And then also as a clinician, it means a lot to me because I've lost guys. I've lost soldiers who've taken their life, who have been seeing me as a clinician. And that's your greatest fear as a clinician is to lose someone to suicide. And man, I wish I had the tools, even as a clinician, of what I know now. I wish I knew then. Maybe the guys that I've lost would still be here today if that was the case, it's so personal for me from that perspective. And that's why, I love what 220 is doing. That's why the tactical resilience is so important, is to create a high degree of awareness amongst our first responders of, hey, you know what? You're not alone. 1, 2, there's help. 3, there's not just treatment available, but there's healing available for this stuff. And it's much more easily accessible than you think it is.
Well, thank you for being willing to share your personal story. I know I kind of dumped that on you, but I appreciate you sharing. If someone wants to recruit you or hire you to help train their agency, how can they reach out to you? What's the process there?
Sure. The easiest way is either you can go to the website, tacpre.com, TACPRE.com, short for Tactical Resilience. That's got all contact information there at the bottom there. You can call. Email me at phil@alpha6international.com, or you can call me. I'll give you my phone number, 662-801-9497. And I'm available, man. This is what I'm passionate about. And man, if there's any way I could be of service or a partner with any organization, law enforcement, first responders, military guys, at all, then this is what I've dedicated my time to now. And if I could serve, that's what I want to do.
Well, Doc, it's been great having you on the program and sharing your insights and wisdom on this subject. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for taking care of not only others, but taking care of you. I think that's a big first step for all of us to first take care of us. And I think that's kind of the resounding message of this talk today is we have to start in-house, right? And if we're going to help others as well. So thank you for what you're doing and thank you for being on the program.
Likewise, Conrad, thanks for having me. And man, once again, thank you for what you're doing with bringing awareness to PTSD and the things that we can do to help heal what's going on within our first responder community. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much for watching and listening to the PTSD 911 Presents podcast. I really appreciate your participation. If you would subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to our email list so you can keep up to date on what we're doing with the film and with this podcast show. We have some great additional interviews coming to you in the next few weeks and months. So please stay tuned as to who we're bringing on. And if you have someone that you would like to hear and see on this show, please send me an email and make an introduction. I would really appreciate it. Hey, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I will talk to you again next time on the PTSD 911 Presents podcast.